Thanks, Naomi, and hey, everyone, and thanks highly for that amazing grounding. There's a lot of intersections with what I'm going to talk about that we'll only be able to touch on, and what Fred is going to talk about. But yeah, I really appreciated it. So over the next 15 minutes, we're going to examine some of the ways that Project 2025 and the right aims to entrench systemic white supremacy in the US and roll back the gains of anti-racist organizing and movement building. Now our main focus here is going to be Project 2025's attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives. But these are just the tip of the iceberg, as we'll discuss, for how Project 2025 aims to, more deeply entrench systemic white supremacy in the U.S. And roll back the gains of our racial justice movements. And one reason I focus on Project 2025 is actually, my focus at PRA, a lot of it is about fighting anti-Semitism. And in the last year, a lot of that has included fighting the ways that the right has weaponized these cynical allegations of anti-Semitism to attack those of us who are taking the streets and taking our college campuses to demand an end to Israel's genocide in Gaza and to fight for freedom and justice for Palestinians. The right has been attacking our social movements with these charges of anti-Semitism to discredit us and to roll back the left and roll back our efforts to protect and expand multiracial democracy. And one of the ways they've been doing this is through attacks on DEI. Since since for over a year they've been peddling the cynical falsehood that DEI is anti-Semitic in a bid to conscript white American Jews like myself into the right's white supremacist coalition, and to also mobilize the rest of white America to have just one more talking point to attack the Black freedom struggle. And I wrote about that a bit in a recent article for PRA that I'll share in the chat. But let me start this slideshow. I just wanted to kind of name how these attacks on DEI have become very personal for me over the last year in a new way, as the right has been conscripting my American Jewish community, on the wrong side of the battle for racial justice that's ongoing in our country, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. So I want to start back, a few years ago, because of course, none of this started with Project 2025, right? The 2020 George Floyd uprising helped to catalyze a societal-wide reckoning with the foundations of systemic white supremacy in the US. And in response to that, the right mobilized a ferocious backlash. We had conservative politicians and pundits, organizations and operatives who launched media and legislative and other campaigns seeking to ban critical race theory from public schools and higher education, from libraries, at employment and other settings. So here we see a CRT Forward as a project of the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA School of Law. And they've tracked over 800 local, state, and federal anti-CRT measures across the country since 2020. This is what they call a non-exhaustive range of bills and resolutions and executive orders, opinion letters, statements, and other measures. So the right used these polemics against CRT, against wokeness, cultural Marxism, and other boogeymen to condition white Americans to see racial justice demands as existential threats. And Hallie did a great job just now connecting this kind of white grievance and conspiratorial thinking to the right's economic agenda, right? It's a bid to conscript white working class folks into a reactionary project And it's a bid also to mobilize the grievance of white America away from a multiracial struggle against the foundations of racial capitalism in the US and into the reactionary agenda. So before long, right, the right added diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI programs and initiatives to this mix of targets. As DEI programs opened and expanded across the country to combat racist bias and inequity across a variety of institutional settings. So here we have the Chronicle of Higher Education. They've tracked 85 anti-DEI bills that have been introduced in 28 states and the US Congress since 2023. And 14 of these have been enshrined into law. This legislation would restrict DEI offices and staff, mandatory DEI training, identity-based hiring and admissions preferences, and more. So according to the Chronicle, over 150 colleges in 19 states have curtailed DEI initiatives in response to this public pressure. And a few slides ago, we saw, one of the architects of this anti-DEI plan, Christopher Rufo, he's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's a conservative operative. He's been behind many of the right's grievance attacks and moral panics against trans folks, against Black folks, against racial justice over the last few years. And this tweet was actually, he tweeted this just after Claudine Gay resigned, as president of Harvard after the racist and sexist backlash campaign against her earlier this year. That, as I said, was also very much part of this whole discourse that DEI is anti-Semitic, because many of the folks who are practicing DEI and on the front lines of racial justice are fighting to end Israel's genocide in Gaza, as they should be, right? But, seeing these struggles is clearly connected. The right is using this also to go after DEI and to go after racial justice gains in the country. And so he tweeted, right, we must not stop until we have abolished DEI ideology, right, from every institution in America. So he's not only talking about DEI institutions themselves, he's also talking about this nebulous category of DEI ideology, by which they basically mean intersectionality, by which they mean the very ideals and practices of racial justice themselves, right? Going back to the Civil Rights Act and earlier, which we're going to talk about. So I also wanted to say that many of these efforts have been pushed by a coordinated network of right-wing think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the Manhattan Institute, where Christopher Rufo is located. And there's a great interview that Hailey actually gave. If one of my colleagues could please put it in the chat. Hailey Gutierrez at PRA, who we just heard from, recently did an interview with Isaac Kamala, who teaches poli-sci at Trinity College in Hartford and directs the Center for Defensive Academic Freedom, called Manufacture. He released a report called Manufacturing Backlash, Right-Wing Think Tanks and the Legislative Attack on Higher Education, that goes in depth into the coordinated network of think tanks who are pushing these attacks on DEI and higher education, which are also a form of class warfare, right? And we're going to talk about that. So just to do a quick case study, this case study was actually developed by Chancey Callahan, a research analyst at PRA, who gave a presentation on Project 2025's attacks on gender justice and gender authoritarianism a couple weeks ago. So at UT Austin, here's one local way that these attacks have manifested. In June of last year, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed SB 17, a bill prohibiting DEI offices and initiatives at state-funded universities by claiming they promote, quote, differential treatment of or providing special benefits to individuals on the basis of race or color or ethnicity. And this arrived on the heels of anti-abortion and anti-trans legislation. And the bill outlined severe penalties for employees who were found to have violated this law. And then the next year, in April 2024, UT Austin laid off over 60 employees who held DEI-related roles. Black staffers made up 33% of the layoffs, despite representing only 7% of university staff overall. And women made up 75% of the layoffs, despite representing 55% of overall staff. And Carmen Chavez, who chaired Mexican American and Latina studies at UT Austin, said, I have no doubt that the ultimate goal is to get rid of all of us who are doing any kind of work that reflects people who do not come from a predominantly white, middle class, heterosexual, and Christian background. So getting now into Project 2025, right? That's been the buildup. These things obviously didn't come out of the blue in Project 2025. And of course, the history of white backlash against racial justice, has its roots in the foundation of our country, if not earlier. So these things obviously did not begin in 2020 either. But Project 2025 continues this unfolding backlash campaign and expands it into a comprehensive assault on anti-racist pedagogy and practice by promising to dismantle DEI initiatives across federal, state, and local government, across the education system, and across civil society. So Kevin Roberts, who's president of the Heritage Foundation, wrote in the introduction, the noxious tenets of critical race theory and gender ideology should be excised from curricula in every public school in the country. These theories poison our children, and the next conservative presidents should make the institutions of American civil society hard targets for woke culture warriors. And Kevin Roberts has already done this. He's a traditionalist Catholic. He's closely aligned with the hard right national conservatism movement. And in 2022, a Texas governor, Greg Abbott, appointed him chair of Texas's 1836 project. That was a similar kind of version of then President Trump's 1776 project that was part of the backlash against the George Floyd uprising, attempting to rewrite American history to remove any mention of systemic white supremacy, the chattel slavery at the heart of racial capitalism, and to really try to undo the growing awareness of white supremacy that was catalyzed by the George Floyd uprising. So Project 2025 seeks to weaponize the federal government to ban DEI and other racial justice initiatives from a range of government agencies. That includes the military, the Departments of Housing and Urban Development, Labor, and the Treasury, the Office of Civil Rights, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and more. It claims, quote, a conservative president should issue an executive order that bans and Congress should pass a law that prohibits the federal government from using taxpayer dollars to fund all critical race theory training. And beyond this, it calls for the repeal of DEI and anti-racism across civil society initiatives. It calls on the Department of Justice to spearhead, quote, a whole of government approach to non-discrimination, not only internally, but also at the state, local, and private sector levels. And of course, non-discrimination here is Orwellian doublespeak, right? They view anti-racism as essentially a form of anti-white discrimination, right? They're trying to flip these terms on their head, to say we are the ones who are concerned about civil rights just for white people, right? And we'll see this kind of doublespeak elsewhere in Project 2025. So this charges the DOJ to, quote, investigate and prosecute all state and local governments, higher education institutions, corporations, and any other private employers for anti-discriminatory or anti-racist policies or pedagogy or trainings. This is a strategy already pursued by America First Legal, a judicial activist org that has close connections to Project 2025 and is headed up by Stephen Miller, who's a former senior advisor to former President Trump. America First Legal has weaponized the 1964 Civil Rights Act against its original intentions by suing major corporations like Nike and Disney for allegedly discriminating against white people through their DEI campaigns. So as a result of this weaponization of the federal government, civil society bodies could be compelled to curtail or close down DEI departments and end a broad range of affirmative action practices. Project 2025 calls on the Department of Housing and Urban Development to end, quote, affirmative race-based policies in housing, and calls on the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission from collecting, quote, racial classifications data in employment for private and public workplaces. So they're essentially trying to make it impossible for the federal government to gather data that would establish a discriminatory patterns in employment, housing, and other spheres. So, I'm not a lawyer, but I want to just look as best as I can at the text of the Civil Rights Act, to try to show you how they're doing this. So they're building on the Supreme Court's 2023 gutting of affirmative action in higher education by calling to, quote, eliminate disparate impact as a valid theory of discrimination for race and other bases under civil rights law. And they're charging that, quote, disparities do not and should not legally imply discrimination per se. So this effectively kneecaps the ability of the federal government to combat systemic racial inequities that could reverse decades of civil rights gains in the US, because disparate impact is a category of discrimination under the 1964 Civil Rights Act that helps to establish discrimination due to a protected characteristic, even when rules employed by landlords or employers are formally neutral, right? And establishing this disparate impact has been a key tool for enforcing a range of civil rights laws, from the Fair Housing Act to federal employment statutes. I'm gonna try to go a little bit quicker, just to take a couple more minutes. So Project 2025 is also laser focused on anti-racist initiatives in public and higher education. It advocates shutting down the Department of Education, calling it a, quote, convenient one-stop shop for the woke education cartel that injects racist, anti-American ahistorical propaganda into America's classrooms. And the DOE is responsible for enforcing the prohibition of discrimination in education. And shuttering it's going to severely hamper the federal government's ability to address systemic racism in education. And this, of course, is a major step forward in the right's long-standing goal of dismantling public education infrastructure in the U.S. It's, a class warfare project of the 1%. They've had their eyes set on higher education and public education for a long time. And it's also an attack on unions, which, highly talked about, right? So, I know that very personally from where I live here in Chicago, right, where the right has been attacking, the Chicago Teachers Union for its defense of public K-12 education for a long time. So, echoing a familiar conservative talking points, right? Project 2025 says, oh, we have to protect the children and empower the rights of parents and states, right? So it calls to remove any references to systemic racism or CRT from K-12 pedagogy. School officials, it states, quote, should not require students or teachers to believe that individuals are guilty or responsible for the actions of others based on race or ethnicity. And it calls again to weaponize state and federal civil rights laws to open investigations into anti-racist practices at public schools. And they list examples of the practices that would be open for investigation. These include, quote, mandatory affinity groups, teacher training programs in which educators are required to confess their privilege, or school assignments in which students must defend the false idea that America is systematically racist. Other education proposals hit Black and Brown communities and low-income folks especially hard, like eliminating Head Start and Title I that provide federal funding for low-income students and schools that serve them. Defunding public education, again, a long-standing goal of the 1% under the guise of, quote, school choice. Like rolling back student higher education loans that help students of color and low-income families, like weakening oversight agencies that promote equity in higher ed. And beyond Project 2025, leading institutions and figures, including the RNC, have called to cut federal funding for any higher education institutions that are, quote, pushing so-called critical race theory, radical gender ideology, or other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content on our children. And just to wrap up, as I said at the beginning, this is only the tip of the iceberg for Project 2025 and the right's systematic attempts to re-entrench white supremacy in this country and to roll back to the gains that have been made since the 2020 George Floyd uprising, since the civil rights movement in this country, right? My colleagues, Annie Wilkinson and Chancey Callahan, made this brilliant slide for us a couple of weeks ago for their presentation that talks a lot about what Highly talked about as well. It's imperative that we see how Project 2025 aims to direct the distribution of wealth and power in society in ways that maintain and perpetuate existing racial, economic, political, and social hierarchies in society. And this is happening across the board, and attacks on DEI and CRT and the like are only one part of that. I want to end with a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, the theorist of intersectionality, in July 2024, when she was interviewed about Project 2025. She said, quote, "We could see this coming after 2020, and we could see that it was probably going to be well organized. Wherever there's been a move to authoritarian rule, it's come through attacks on history, on ideas, on the political power of marginalized groups. It happened in the 19th century, and it's happening now in the 21st century. And hopefully in the Q&A, we could talk a little bit about strategies to fight back, because that's obviously really important too. But I am out of time, so I'm going to pass it back to Naomi to hear from Naomi and from Fred. Thanks, everyone.